Hey buddy, my name's Gregory and welcome to Tell Me More, the series where we explore the strange and unexplained. It's crazy that we're almost already halfway through season 2 of the series, but don't worry, there's plenty more to come. I know I've been coming at you hard and fast with lots to think about lately, so I thought that we deserved a little break this week. And what better way to break up a series like this than with a Monster of the Month creature feature. Today we're gonna go back to one of the oldest modern cases, back to 1955 to explore the Kentucky Goblins. If you've been paying attention since the beginning, last season I started off by getting into a couple of classic cryptid cases, Bigfoot and Mothman. And while researching those guys, it's hard to get too far into that world without coming across a couple of names like John Keel, Ivan Sanderson, Lorne Coleman, and other researchers into the Fortean phenomena. And it doesn't take you too long to come across some of the bizarre stories from the West Virginia area from the 50s and 60s. UFOs, ghosts, cryptids, and tucked away in the corner between them all rests this bizarre story that always seems to draw me in: the Kelly Hopkinsville incident. This story is known by many names: the Kelly Hopkinsville encounter, the Hopkinsville Goblins, the Kentucky Goblins, and many more variants of those names. The name of this encounter is almost as varied and disputed as the actual story of what happened that night, and almost as varied and disputed as the descriptions of the creatures themselves. It sounds like an urban legend, and based on what you can find about it online, it reads like one too. It was a hot and humid night on the 21st of August, 1955, in the small community of Kelly, Christian County, Western Kentucky. Mrs. Langford was at home with her 3 children, along with her adult sons from a previous marriage. Elmer Lucky Sutton and Charlie J.C. Sutton were visiting with their wives and a few of their friends, who included Billy Ray Taylor from Pennsylvania, who worked with Lucky as a traveling carnival worker. In total, there were 11 people in the home that night. 8 adults and 3 children. After dinner, the adults sat down to play a few rounds of cards. It was Billy Ray's turn to find something to drink. Mrs. Langford was strictly religious and didn't allow alcohol in her home, so water was the drink of choice that night. The property didn't have running water, so Billy Ray had to go out to the well to collect it in a bucket. There was no daylight savings in 1955, so it was beginning to get quite dark. Billy Ray says that he saw something strange streak across the sky. Billy Ray first saw a bright light that approached from the southwest of where he was standing. As it got closer, he saw a large disc-shaped object that had different colored rainbow streaks streaming from the rear, and it was emitting an awful hissing sound. He saw it cross a number of fields before it eventually settled down about a quarter mile away from the house. He could still see a glow coming from the ravine as he grabbed his bucket and ran back into the house to tell the others. They basically laughed it off at the time, assuming that Billy Ray was overreacting to seeing a shooting star. He wanted Elmer to go with him to see what landed near the ravine, but he basically flat out refused, saying he didn't want to trespass on a bunch of other properties and ditches in the middle of the night in the dead heat. About an hour later, the group heard one of their dogs barking outside. The barking got louder and more frenzied, to the point that Elmer decided he should see what got them so worked up. Accompanied by Billy Ray, they walked outside into the darkness following the sound of the dog. As they approached the sound of the barking, the dog sprinted past them and hid underneath the house. It was at this time they saw something beginning to stir in the tree line. Not quite sure what they were looking at, they began to focus their gaze, and as it approached closer, they could see that it was some sort of a strange creature. The boys turned and ran back to the house. They grabbed a couple of weapons, a .22 pistol and a 20-gauge shotgun. Mrs. Langford begged them to stop this nonsense, as she thought that they were just trying to spook their wives and their children. It wasn't until the men opened the door and stepped outside that Mrs. Langford could see that the creature was indeed real. and that they weren't joking. It was described as 3 to 4 foot tall, with a large head and tall, sharply pointed ears. The eyes were on the side of its head and glowed in a strange yellow color. It had long, thin arms with webbed claw-like hands that almost touched the ground. Bizarrely, it's claimed that it had short legs that appeared to float above the ground. Its entire body had a strange metallic luminosity. The boys stepped off the porch and fired multiple rounds into the entity at practically point-blank range. The shots made a noise like they were hitting an empty metal bucket. They knocked the creature down, but instead of staying down, it bounced right back up and scuttled off into the woods. Not quite sure what they had just witnessed, the adults went back inside, trying to rationalize what they just saw. A creature, exactly like the one they had just shot, peered through the window at them, causing Mrs. Lankford to scream. The men shot the entity through the window, and it got knocked back by the blast. They immediately ran outside to see if it stayed down this time, but they found nothing. Billy Ray peered over the porch into the darkness to see if it had fallen off the edge. As he did, a clawed hand reached down from the roof overhang and tried to grab him by his hair. Everyone screamed. His wife lunged forward and pulled him back, just narrowly missing its clutches. This was what was to be the beginning of a 3-hour siege with the creatures, appearing and disappearing on the roof and the trees, being shot repeatedly without apparent injury. Even one seemed to float over 40 feet from the rooftop to the fence. At 11 p.m., they all decided they needed to evacuate the house, so they waited until there was a lull in the activity when they all jumped into the cars and drove 8 miles to the South Hopkinsville police station, where Sheriff Greenwell took their statements. Naturally, the police were pretty shocked by their story. 8 seemingly sober adults rushed to the police station at 11 p.m. on a Sunday night, claiming to have seen a UFO land in their field, and subsequently 15 seemingly invincible aliens try to invade their home for 3 hours straight, forcing them to resort to using over 200 rounds of ammunition to fend them off. To no avail. But the police decided to take their story seriously, because the emotional state that they were in indicated that something must have happened at the Sutton house that night, with Sheriff Greenwell saying, "These are not the sorts of people who normally run to the police." Something frightened them, something beyond their comprehension. Little did the Sutton and Taylor clans realize at the time, but the police did, that independently, a state trooper reported seeing a meteor-like object flying low over Kelly at about 11 p.m. that night, and artillery sounds were heard coming from the object. The sheriff and his deputy decided around 12:30 that they wanted backup before they attended the house, so they instructed an officer at the station to call for additional officers, sheriff's deputies, and state trooper units. When asked if he should contact the Air Force as well, the sheriff said that that wouldn't be necessary, but to contact Fort Campbell instead, who decided to send 4 military police officers to the scene. In total, about 20 law enforcement personnel were sent to the Sutton home to investigate. After the police left, the family started to settle down for bed when they heard a scratching sound on the roof. When they went to investigate, they once again saw one of these creatures staring at them through the window. Again, they opened fire. This confrontation would continue for quite some time. This was one of the very first examples in the modern era of a close encounter of the third kind. Even the phrase "little green men" can be traced back to the Kelly Hopkinsville incident. Don't forget to like this video, that really helps me out a lot. If you're new here and you're loving this video, make sure to hit subscribe and the notification bell now so you never miss another episode. I upload new content every Thursday. And don't forget to check out the Tell Me More playlist for hours of content to keep you entertained and thinking. I talked about J. Allen Hynek and Project Blue Book in my Mothman and Rendlesham Forest videos. Though it seemed the purpose of the program was to discredit and debunk UFO encrypted sightings during the Cold War, Hynek himself was adamant that one cannot simply dismiss these claims. But it seems as if Project Blue Book decided not to do an investigation into this claim in 1955, instead deciding to label it as a hoax with no further comment. In fact, the Air Force didn't do an investigation investigation at all, instead relying on the disingenuous police report to make their determination instead. It seems that the police had no interest in making sense of what the family had witnessed that night, instead mocking them, accusing them of being drunk on moonshine, and also going as far as to claim that they had seen monkeys that had escaped from a nearby circus, with no proof that any of those things were true. The media even took to discrediting the family, claiming that the mother was a member of a religious cult, downplaying the number of adults in the home, making it seem like most of the 11 people in the house were children. But none of that was true either. In my Mothman series, I mentioned a man named John Keel, a beatnik-like character who would roll into town and investigate the local UFO and cryptid claims in the 1950s and 60s in the West Virginia area. His claim to fame was a book called The Mothman Prophecies, after having spent 2 years compiling stories about the Mothman event in Point Pleasant. I also mentioned a contemporary of his, Ivan T. Sanderson, who would also roll into these towns after they had encountered a cryptid or an alien. And as a biologist, he would lend credibility to these stories by reasoning what the biology of these creatures might be. The Forteans at the time didn't make any public statements or write any articles or release any biological theories on the goblins. All we get are these bizarre photos of Ivan T. Sanderson standing next to a cardboard cutout of one of the goblins in John Keel's apartment, apparently taken for a laugh while they were socializing one night. In a time when these characters were all over every popular sighting in the region, why did nobody want to have anything to do with this case? Why did no popular UFO or cryptid hunter want to put their name on this story? Why did they avoid making public statements on it? I found that all wholly unsatisfying, so I dug a little bit deeper and I found that Project Blue Book's decision to label this as a hoax had nothing to do with the validity of the story itself, nor the disingenuous police investigation, nor the unfavorable coverage by the media. Instead, the decision had more to do with the way that they label claims in general, deciding to ignore most face-to-face encounters with aliens, as the stories were often unreliable and impossible to investigate, rarely yielding usable results. However, it turns out that Hynek himself actually did interview the family a year after the event took place, which he wrote about in his book years later. It doesn't go into great detail about the story, but takes time to tell an accurate, faithful depiction of the events, with none of the myths or lies attached to it. What's really bizarre is how he got into the case in the first place. In his book, Hynek said that he was setting up 12 satellite listening stations across the United States, and one of the electronic technicians, Bud Ledwith, who was setting up quartz clock cameras, just so happened to be a sound engineer at the local radio station during the Kelly Hopkinsville encounter. In fact, he was the first reporter on the scene, and he was even the one who drew the most famous sketches based on the family's testimony. When hearing this, Hynek sent lead investigator Isabel Davis to interview the family in 1956. What are the chances? Was Bud Ledwith a secret agent working at the local station? Was it common practice for the Air Force and CIA to set up agents and radio stations across America to keep their ear to the ground? I mean, think about it. In the 1950s, something crazy happens. Who is the first one you call? The local radio station. Though there's no case file for this event in the Blue Book archives, Hynek claims that he personally believes that this story did actually take place, that he personally believes the testimony of the family. And though he doesn't come to any conclusions about what they've witnessed, he says that the family did see something that night. But what exactly did they see? To hear my thoughts on this and see an extended version of this video, head on over to my Patreon. In the end, there was no evidence that these creatures existed at all. No tracks, no blood, no markings, no damage to the property. There was apparently a single patch of glowing earth that the police spent some time looking at, and apparently a green glow coming from the woods, but the police chalked that up to foxfire, which is a type of mushroom that bioluminesces. The only real evidence that this event took place were the spent shell casings all over the property, and the blown out holes in the windows from the 3 men shooting from inside the house. If we want to go on evidence alone, then we have to say that this event never even happened. it was just a figment of their imagination? That answer doesn't really work for me here. I find it really difficult to call 8 sober Southern Christian adults liars. And maybe you could say that because so many of them were carnival folk, carnies, that they were the type to spin crazy stories, and maybe they were. Who knows? But the fact that they decided to go to the police when they could have just walked away from the situation pretending that it never happened, that sticks out to me. That's why the police said that they didn't seem like the type to go to the police. In fact, one of the daughters of the witnesses, Geraldine Sutton Stith, wrote a book about the event and also goes on tour talking about it, saying that when her father would recall the story, it wasn't a novelty to him. It wouldn't make him laugh or smile. In fact, he would get pale in the face when he would tell the story. But it seems that Geraldine is going on tour with this story because no other member of the family is willing to talk about it publicly at all. And I can't help but feel that that lends a ton of credibility to this story. The only explanation that made any kind of sense at all was that that shooting star was in fact a falling meteorite, as a state trooper reported that it was making artillery sounds. That might have been the sound of it breaking up in the atmosphere. And then upon investigating it while collecting water from the well, Billy Ray accidentally agitated a group of great horned owls, who then subsequently attacked the house believing that they were defending their territory. And even though that explanation works, it doesn't explain how 11 people thought that they were seeing the same thing. If this family was shooting owls, there would be blood and feathers everywhere. And I've gotten pretty tired of the owl explanation, because as we move forward in this series, you'll notice that it's the #1 explanation for cryptid sightings in the 50s and 60s. Like, people didn't know what an owl looked like. I know this season that I've been trying to link all my videos together, leading from the military, to aliens, to secret underground facilities, and this video was supposed to have nothing to do with any of that. It wasn't supposed to link together at all. This was supposed to be a creature feature to break up the series. Well, it turns out that this story perfectly fits in with that criteria. Way too perfectly, in fact. And that was a total accident. I didn't even mean to do that. But it turns out that Kentucky has plenty of old mines and an intricate cave system. Apparently, even to this day, people claim to see little monsters or goblins coming out of these old mines, playing around in their backyards, running around in the woods. Planet Weird even did a series about the goblin-like creatures called Hellier. There are even rumors of a deep underground military base in the Kentucky area. Some people say that the ship that the creatures arrived in was confiscated by the military and taken to a nearby underground base. Well, it turns out that the field that the ship landed in near the Sutton home in 1955 is directly next to a cave entrance. And these caves are not isolated either. They're actually part of a vast network. In fact, there's a whole cave system throughout the United States, and it seems to perfectly correlate with a lot of the most active paranormal locations. Ghosts, aliens, cryptids, strange missing peoples cases all seem to be very common in areas of this network. I went into this story assuming that because it was so easy to dismiss due to a lack of useful information or evidence, that I'd be able to walk away from it with a sense that I had a really good grip about what happened around the goblin phenomenon. But I cannot dismiss this story. I can't shake the feeling that there was something there, something elusive and mysterious, but very real. Tell me what you guys think. Thank you for watching. Make sure to check out my second channel, Armoured Gregory, where I do follow-up vlogs responding to some of my favorite comments. And I recently just launched a new podcast called Full Metal Tuxedo. The links are in the description for both. And of course, I'd like to thank my patrons and channel members for supporting my work. I couldn't do this without you. You're amazing.